Now, I'm not being sacrilegious here, but here's another theory. What if this man named Jesus happened to have come from another planetary system, was on this planet, did these remarkable things that have been documented, was killed, crucified, and they beamed him aboard. They beamed his body aboard. They put him back to life somehow, and they sent him back down again. And the image of the shroud was caused by this Star Trek-like beaming of his body.
Well, I'd say, George, we have an idea for a great new novel then. Because, look, I can't speak to that. I mean, it's sort of the last...
It's a theory.
That aliens might have done this, or Jesus might have been an alien. I've actually heard that before. Again, it's something that I can't really speak to that in any kind of legitimate way. I haven't studied that.
Don't send me to hell for that one.
No,
right?
no. Listen, well, remember, George, I'm Jewish, so already I'm sort of the odd man out here. It's sort of an ironic situation that I have found myself in after all these years of being on your program and documentaries and doing interviews and lectures on the Shroud of Turin, something I never dreamed I would.
Well, are you at conflict with yourself, with your own beliefs?
Not at all. Not at all. And then let me quickly go back to the beginning and tell you how I got involved, and it'll sort of give you a sense of what I was thinking at the time, and then I can tell you what I'm thinking now.
Well, because Jewish people believe Jesus was real, but they don't believe he was the Messiah, right?
Exactly. And that's the point. But I had a photographic studio in Santa Barbara, California, back in the 70s, and I specialized in scientific and technical and medical things, but I did all kinds of work, commercial studio. Mm-hmm. I was hired as a consultant on a photographic project for Los Alamos National Laboratories. And, of course, with Los Alamos, that it had to be something to do with atomic bombs. That's their primary product there, or at least it has been over the decades. After 7 months of working on this project with the folks at Los Alamos, I was finished and I moved on. A few months later, the gentleman I worked with on that project called me up and he said, "Barrie, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And my answer was telling. I said, "But Don, I'm Jewish." That was my first response. And then he reminded me that he too was Jewish, and and he said, "Look, some guys have found some new properties of the image on the shroud. They're trying to put a team together and maybe get permission to examine it and try and determine how this image was formed." Well, I was interested in the image properties because I'm a photographer, but I was very hesitant and felt very uncomfortable being involved with something that was so obviously a Christian relic, and I wasn't a Christian.
Well, don't forget, Jesus was Jewish.
Well, so a few months into the project, I turned to Don Lynn, may he rest in peace. He was the imaging project manager at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for the Voyager, Viking, Mariner, and Galileo probes, just to name a few. He was the true imaging expert of our team. And I remember saying to Don one day, "Gee, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing involved with this?" And he said exactly what you said, George. He said, "Barrie, have you forgotten that the man in question is a Jew?" And I said, "No, I know that." And he says, "So you don't think God wants one of his chosen people on our team?" And I laughed. And then he gave me some good advice. He said, "Look, go to Turin, do the best job you can, stop worrying about why. Just do the best job you can." And then he said these words. He said, "God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know." Well, that was good enough to satisfy me and keep me on that team. And it only took me 17 years after the event of examining it, holding it, touching it. It took 17 years for the evidence to finally, the last piece of evidence to come in and finally convince me that this has to be authentic. I'm going to quote Arthur Conan Doyle, who once said that if you eliminate all the other possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is the likely answer.
Yep.
And in the case of the shroud, by eliminating all the possibilities, the only thing I was left with was that this is an artifact of the historic Jesus.
Well, have we eliminated all the possibilities?
Well, all the known possibilities to date, I think, there have been, as you know, hundreds of efforts over the decades, especially since we came back from Turin in '78, at duplicating the image on the shroud and at saying, "Oh, look, it's a photograph, it's a painting, it's a rubbing, it's a scorching with a hot statue." Well, George, it can't be all those things, and it doesn't have the properties of any of those things. So it's neither a painting nor a photograph nor a rubbing nor a scorch with a hot statue. I mean, we did tests. Look, it was not unusual for us to understand at the time that this cloth might have been a painting. So we took all the tests possible to look for patent pigments.
Hey, Barrie, when we come back, Jerry Corsi's going to join us for a half hour or so as we continue talking about your work, Turin's Shroud, the illustrated evidence. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And for the first half hour or so, Jerry Corsi will join us. Jerry's working on a novel on the Shroud of Turin, so we'll talk with him about that along with Barrie Schwortz on Coast to Coast AM. Well, if you've been listening to Coast over the past few years, you know Dr. Jerome Corsi. He is a doctor, PhD type from Harvard University in political science. He also writes for WorldNet Daily, quite accomplished author as well. And Jerry is joining us and Barrie Schwortz as we talk about the Shroud. Jerome has an upcoming book, a novel on the Shroud of Turin. Jerry, what led finally into the novel world? You've always been writing nonfiction.
Well, George, I've always wanted to write fiction. I think in the rest of my career I plan to write quite a bit more fiction. And the Shroud has fascinated me for decades, and I thought it was a great place to start. And Simon & Schuster loved the book, and so it'll be out in April. It's called the Shroud Codex.
Super. Well, I'm sure we'll talk to you about that when that comes out, Jerome. I wanted to bring you out, Jerry, to talk with Barrie for just a little bit. You add a different perspective here. You know Barrie. He's on the other line, so go ahead and chat for a little bit. I want to learn from both of you. Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, first of all, I want to say I've got a great deal of respect for Barrie. Barrie, as the chief photographer for the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project, I think did the most impressive and by far the most exhaustive and authoritative photographic record of the Shroud that's ever been done. And Barrie, I'm going to be very honored to use your photographs in the Shroud Codex, and it's great to talk with you tonight on Coast to Coast.
My pleasure, Jerry, and I was going to kind of tongue-in-cheek say we've got to stop meeting like this. But there are people listening.
Well, we've been going back and forth, and I'll tell you, the images Barrie has are breathtaking. And it's one thing to read about the Shroud. It's another thing even to see the photographs that are reproduced in many books. But when you see the high-quality photographs that Barrie's got, you realize this is the photograph of a real man that's in the Shroud. It's very impressive, and it adds a whole other dimension to the appreciation of what the Shroud is all about.
Well, I appreciate that, Jerry. You know, I got to say this, George, that typically most of the people I deal with are writing nonfiction works. Mm-hmm. On a few occasions, somebody will come along that wants to do a work of fiction, and I'm willing to be. Look, I'm happy to work with anyone who is interested in getting accurate information about the Shroud of Turin. And when Jerry approached me, I could tell immediately, just by looking at his credentials, that I was dealing with somebody who was a real scholar in his own right and a great writer and an author. And so I was happy to work with him to try and provide him with the kind of materials that he needs to illustrate, even though it is a work of fiction, to illustrate his book.
Well, one of the things that really, I mean, I've got the anatomical accuracy of the man in the Shroud of Turin, Barrie's photographs capture. I just want to kind of plunge in on one or two points. In my novel, I focus on several of the really terrible aspects of the crucifixion of this man in the Shroud of Turin, whom I do believe is Jesus Christ. I think it's an authentic document. I think it's an authentic relic, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. But I'm writing at length in the novel, Shroud Codex, about the scourge marks, and the scourge marks on the body are horrifying. I mean, there must be the scourging had to be so brutal that the man in the shroud must have almost died from the scourging. The scourging was with a flagellum, a Roman whip, short leather thongs with these dumbbell metal weights at the end of each thong.
Oh, they snap when you get hit, right?
Yeah, they're terrible. And various photographs are just capture the detail in such a tremendous ability to visualize in 3 dimensions just looking at the photographs. And Barrie, would you agree on that?